In this lesson, we'll learn how to use Max's orientation constraint. So the orientation constraint is kind of like the position constraint, only this time we're controlling rotation. Now, before we go ahead and apply this, let me go ahead and show you the usefulness of using this constraint. As of right now, yes, we control the position of our arm, but notice how the orientation of the wrist is also affected. If we wanted this character's hand to plant, that's not possible right now because the orientation of the wrist is not locked. So you can see if I were to go ahead and grab the upper arm and just start to move that bone around, you can see how the wrist moves. So the orientation constraint will help us to prevent these types of issues so our character can plant his arm. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started now. Heading back to layers, we'll go in and hide the character's arm and armor, just to make this easier on us. Now we'd apply the constraint the same way. Let's go ahead and grab the wrist. And now we can head over to our animation menu and choose the orientation constraint found right at the bottom. Watch what will happen when we apply the constraint with its initial settings. Notice how the wrist is going to switch to the space of our animation control. Essentially what we have done was oriented this bone to the same orientation of our control object. And that shift is not good because we want to make sure our characters stay in their initial pose, the pose they were designed in. Alright, so we know we have a few options to fix this. The one that we are most familiar with is keep initial offset. So notice when we go ahead and use that, the wrist is now going to move back to its original position, and we still have full control over its orientation. So going back to the upper arm, if we were to go ahead and move this around, you can see how the wrist is no longer going to shift around as it did before. It's going to stay put, which is really cool. But now, with using keep initial offset, we do have offset values to worry about, and sometimes that may run into weird rotation issues, possibly flipping. And because of this, there is another way we can get the same type of result, but it's much cleaner. So let me go ahead and show you how to do this. What I'll do is go ahead and get rid of the orientation constraint. We can go ahead and select the controller here and choose delete. Next, what we'll do is create an intermediate object that the wrist will be orient constrained to. That object will want to make sure that it is aligned perfectly to our wrist so that when we apply the orientation constraint, there's going to be no shifting, no need for keep initial offset. So let's go ahead and create a helper. Alright, so once it's been made, we can now go ahead and use Alt-A to align this to our wrist bone. So let's go ahead and choose the wrist bone, and notice we can align in position as well as orientation. So let's make sure all three of these axes are checked. So now when we choose OK, notice the helper is perfectly matched. It might be a good idea to rename this, just for clarity. So we can use a naming convention of PT Ori since it's matched to the orientation of this bone, followed by an _L _ wrist 01. Okay, so let's take a look. If we were to go back to our wrist bone, we can now apply another orientation constraint, but this time to our intermediate object, the helper. Take a look, there's no shifting. Okay, keep initial offset is off. So that's great. If we were to go to the helper, we can go ahead and rotate it around, and it's going to control the wrist perfectly. Remember, it's just controlling the orientation, so if we were to go to our move tool and try to move this around, notice we do not affect the wrist in its position at all, which is very nice because that gives us more options then. But what we'd want to do from here is take the helper and link it to our animation control. Great. And we don't really need to freeze the transforms of this helper. You can if you'd like, if you wanted to have it revert back to this position. But remember, we have already frozen the transformations of our arm control. And that's what counts. So if we need to get back to our neutral pose, it'd be a matter of using transform to 0 from our animate quad menu. Alright, so that's a look at how we can work with the orientation constraint. I'd also like to point out, just going back to the wrist, that we have very similar settings that we have on the position constraint. All right, so we know how to work with these options, but I just wanted to kind of point that out to you as well. And we can most certainly go in and add orient targets the same way we can add position targets. All right, well, if we were to go ahead and bring back our character's arm and armor, let's go ahead and take a look here. If we were to grab the upper arm, notice now that wrist is going to stay glued down. So we have now created a system where the hand can remain planted if it needs to. Very exciting. All right, so that's a look at a few constraints in 3ds Max. If you'd like to learn how to use other constraints, like the link constraint, which locks down all 3 transform controllers, position, rotation, and scaling, feel free to take a look at our animating with props tutorial. And if you'd like to learn how to have the orientation of an object follow the position of another, this is the look at constraint, feel free to take a look at our course on rigging characters, but it takes more of an introductory look. It's called Introduction to Character Rigging, but that will give you an idea of how to work with that constraint to control your character's eye movements. All right, but that's it for this lesson. In the next lesson, we are going to start the process of creating custom attributes to drive other areas on our arm rig.